Recording in progress.
Okay, not right. Okay, let's start again. This is part 3 of our 3-part series about the life of Rabbi Tendler. And it's our final session together as we explore his life. And we've seen some different aspects of his life that I think I want to call out as we kind of try to give another element or another piece of his personality, his life, and his contribution to Jewish life. We talked in our first session about swordfish and whether swordfish were kosher to eat or not kosher to eat. And we talked about how Rabbi Tendler played such an important role in not only kind of being like the father of Torah and Mada together, Torah and science being fused as one, and how he was using science in a way that really, up until that point, really wasn't being used, and really was the father of like, let's call it like a medical halacha and the entire sphere. Last week, we talked about brain death, where also he played an important role. And we spent last week's focus a little bit more on his relationship, his special relationship with his father-in-law, Rabbi Moshe Feinstein. And we spoke a little bit about the complexity of that relationship being, on the one hand, his son-in-law, on the other hand, being a doctor and a rabbi, and the fact that there is confusion as to what Rabbi Feinstein did or didn't say, which are the most important shuvas, relatively speaking, to that issue that continues to be a debate to this day. So what I want to focus on today is another one of Rabbi Tendler's most outspoken positions, and that is the topic of Metzizah BaPeh. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with what we mean by Metzizah BaPeh, let me just give you a story that happened some time ago, and it goes as follows. There was a series of babies that had become infected with serious life-threatening sores in their groin areas right after they had their circumcisions. And so right after their bris, some physicians and even some rabbis suggested that what was the cause for this illness, that it was coming from Metzizah BaPeh, which is the ancient tradition of what we'll call oral suction, which is where the mohel will suck the blood. We'll see this in the source and explain more after the incision, after the Brit Milah. Now, the mohel was charged as having had some type of communicable disease, and it would pass it on to the children, who then, because they were babies and infants, they themselves got quite ill, and they were much more susceptible to the sickness than the mohel was. The mohel didn't show any symptoms, but unfortunately the children did. And so as a result, doctors and rabbis also condemned this practice of Metzizah BaPeh, and some even went so far as to get the government involved, trying to stop this. Whereas some rabbis, on the other hand, the community reacted by defending the practice, by saying this is our tradition, this is how it's always been done. We don't need government interventions, right? There's no conclusive proof that this in fact is dangerous, and so on and so forth. And you might think that I'm telling you a story that's happened maybe just a couple of days ago, a couple of years ago. The truth is, this is what was happening in the 1830s. In the 1830s, in different communities across the globe, as we'll see inside. So this issue of Metzizah BaPeh, oral suction, following a Brit Milah, following a circumcision, this really picked up steam for the first time in the 1830s to challenge this question when this situation and these circumstances happen. I just want to make a side point. You'll know as you get to know me better that I'm anything but grammar expert, and maybe some of our friends on Zoom might know better than I. But I believe that the correct grammar is actually Metzizah BaPeh, not Metzizah BaPeh, without a dagesh. But for some reason, we all call it Metzizah BaPeh. I have to do more homework as to why that's the case. But like, if my grammar from Hebrew,
it should be BaPeh or BaPeh.
Yeah, so
it
maybe
depends if there's a flower pepper under the bed.
Correct. So that's, but anyways, we call it Metzizah BaPeh. That's what we call it today, and that's how we will refer to it in our time together. So again, like all the other topics that we've discussed, from swordfish to brain death and anything else we'll study, this literally could be like a 3-part series unto itself. And if we're interested, we can certainly do that. But I want to just, like we've done for the other previous classes, what I really would like to do is I would like to delve a little bit deeper. I would like to be able to, hang on one sec. Just wave if you can hear me in Zoom on. Can you guys hear me? Can somebody wave? No.
I have confirmation.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. I wasn't sure if it was working because I'm manning this and speaking. So what I want to do is, like we've been doing the last couple of weeks, is I want to just kind of create some foundational principles for us to be familiar with, and then we'll fast forward to Rabbi Tendler's life and see how he fits into all of this. So let's start with source number one, box number one, the Gemara in Shabbos, which is really just the Mishnah in Shabbos. And it reads as follows: Osin kol tzorchei milah b'Shabbos. So this is a question: are you allowed to do a brit milah on Shabbat? Is it allowed to be done? Now there are certain circumstances when a brit milah would actually not be done on Shabbat. We would actually postpone it to the next day. But let's talk about a regular situation. So osin kol tzorchei milah b'Shabbos. So again, if the 8th day of a baby's life happens on Shabbat, we can do a brit milah on Shabbat. And so the Mishnah now is going to describe what do we mean by brit milah. Like we use the word brit milah, we use the word circumcision, we use the word bris colloquially. We say, oh, we're going to a bris, but what do we actually mean by that? What do we mean with those pieces? So the Mishnah and the Gemara explain: Mohalin uporim motzim v'notin aleh ispalanit v'chamon. A person is what they're allowed to do. The mohel on Shabbos is allowed to do the mohel. He's allowed to do the circumcision of the foreskin. He's allowed to do the priya, which is where you uncover the skin by removing the thin membrane beneath the foreskin. And in addition to that, he does something called Metzizah, which is, again, the oral, which is the sucking the blood from the wound. And notin ala isplanit v'chamon, he also places bandages and kumen as a salve. This is ways that this is how they would bandage the wound at the time to make sure that everything would be okay. So again, those are the things. There's 4 things, maybe even 3, depending on how you read this Mishnah: Mila, Priya, and Metzizah, with also putting the salve on the wound. These are the components of the Brit Milah. Now, what's interesting is that who was the first person who's commanded to do a Brit Milah? Avram Avinu, right? Avram, we read just a few weeks ago, Avram is commanded to circumcise himself as well as to circumcise everybody in his home, from like everybody, including Ishmael and everyone else. So what's interesting is, what did Abraham's Brit Milah, what he did, and if that is the source of Brit Milah, which, by the way, just as a side point, opens up a really fascinating discussion about which mitzvos, if any, did the forefathers keep, and are the root of all the mitzvos coming from different things that happen in the stories of the forefathers, or is the commandments and the purpose of mitzvos come because God gave them to Moshe at Sinai, and therefore we have from the Torah at Sinai, whatever it is that we received, that is the why we do mitzvahs. So this is an interesting point, because Avram is commanded to do the mitzvah milah, the mitzvah circumcision, and so therefore we know that we also do the mitzvah circumcision. The question the Gemara in Yevamos wants to know is that when the Jewish people enter the land of Israel with Yoshua, what do they have to do? What's the first thing that Yoshua makes them do? Brit Milah. Everybody has to do a Brit Milah. So we have a problem. If you want to suggest that everyone was doing a Brit Milah, so if everyone was doing a Brit Milah, all the Jewish men had circumcisions already, all the babies had circumcisions. So what is Yoshua doing when they got there? So the Gemara wants to know this. The Gemara in Yevamos, box number 2. Amar Rabbi bar Yitzchak, Amar Rav lo nina priya milah la'Avram Avinu. The mitzvah of priya, the component of priya, which we describe as like the uncovering of the skin by removing the thin membrane beneath the foreskin. So not the cutting, not the milah, the priya was not given to Avraham. As we see from Sefer Yoshua in chapter 5, that he's told to come back and do a Brit Milah again. So the indication must be based on this pasuk, based on the fact that Yoshua himself is commanded, is that there was some element of the mitzvah of Brit Milah, which Abraham did, and subsequently all the Jewish people did after that they did, but something new had to happen as well, which is the mitzvah of Priya. So the Gemara wants to suggest that when Abraham and all the Jewish people, up till the time of Yeshua, they had a milah, they simply had the foreskin cut, but Priya, the next step of the Brit Milah, did not happen. And the Gemara is going to continue, and it's going to go back and forth, and it's going to debate this, and it's going to conclude. If you look in the last part of this box number 2, it says, the Gemara explains, so the end of the Gemara here, I'm summarizing it for time, basically explains that you might think that only the first part about the Brit Milah, the actual cutting of the foreskin, was the most important part of the mitzvah. And if a person doesn't do Priya, doesn't do the uncovering, so then it's fine. Comes this pasuk to teach us that both elements are integral to the mitzvah of Milah. And if a person doesn't do both, then they have not fulfilled their obligation of Brit Milah. Now, what is missing from this Gemara? what element of the first Mishnah that we saw in Gemara Shabbos in that first box is seemingly missing? Metzizah, or this part of putting a salve on the wound. The Gemara here is describing that there is two components that are really important, but the Gemara does not seem to be talking anything whatsoever about Metzizah. And so the question we have to ask ourselves is, what is the purpose of Metzizah? Why was it included as something that was allowed to be done on Shabbat? And for what reason is it part of this mitzvah, or is it part of the Brit Milah, or is it not? So that takes us to box number 3 in the Mishnah.
Then you can ask the same, I would say.
Yeah.
Posit about the explaining.
Yeah, it's the same story,
So
correct? Yes.
Maybe from there you see that the Metzizah is really part of, just like the explanate, that the bris is.
Correct. So what Aryeh is saying, is we're about to say in just 1 second, you're a step ahead of me, is that perhaps we can suggest that well, let's actually look at it inside and you'll see it for us. So good. So Mishnah in Shabbos. This is Perek Yotet, Mishnah Vav, chapter 19, Mishnah number 6. So these are the shreds of flesh that invalidate the circumcision. In other words, if they're not cut. So again, the Mishnah is going to tell us, the essential element of circumcision is the removal of the flesh that covers most of the corona. And a child who's not circumcised in this way is not considered circumcised and therefore can't eat truma. If he's the child is very fleshy, right? It looks, for instance, as if he didn't have a Brit Milah done. So you actually have to go back and fix the bris milah, even though technically it was good. But if it's like it doesn't look like a child had a Brit Milah, that's a problem. And here we go. The Mishnah tells us a person who circumcises but doesn't uncover the flesh, again, doesn't do priya, it's as if he never did the milah at all. And so totally left out are these two elements that the first Mishnah alluded to. And so therefore the Gemara in Shabbos wants to know, if you turn to box number 4 on page 133b, take a look here at box number 4. So the Gemara in Shabbos here wants to know, so then what's the point of doing Metzizah? If it's not an integral part of the Brit Milah, so then why do we even do it? So Amar Papa, Hai Umna de lo Mait Sakanahu Ma'abrinan Le. Where Papa says, a craftsman. What do we mean by a craftsman? A moel, right? A moel who doesn't do Metzizah. A moel who doesn't do oral suction after the circumcision, what is he doing? Is a danger to the child undergoing circumcision, and you remove him from being a moel. So what does that mean? So pshita, that's obvious, the Gemara says. Obviously, the fact that the Mishnah previously told us that a person is allowed to do Metzizah on Shabbos, the only time we have to make an exception to a rule on Shabbat is if someone's life is in danger, or there's some type of super exception or a special mitzvah. So obviously it was a sakana. The only reason why a person would ever think Metzizah is necessary, oral suction has to do with sakana, has to do with danger. So you might have thought, for example, that you weren't allowed to do it because it was an issue of drawing blood, which could have been considered to be one of the malachos. Comes to tell you, no, that this blood is different, and therefore it is really about sakana. V'dumya displanit v'chamon. It's similar, just like Aryeh said, to the halachos of bandages and kumin. Ma isplanit v'chamon kilo avid sakanahu af hachanami kilo avid sakanahu. It is dangerous not to do Metzizah. It is dangerous for a person not to suck the blood from the wound for the baby. That's what the Gemara tells us. This is the halacha that we see here, and the Rambam says it similarly. We see here the Rambam teaches here, based on this Gemara Shulchan Aruch as well, that the focus of the idea is it's really about sakana. And look at the language the Rambam uses in particular. It's the Rambam gives like very detailed explanation here, right? Ketzad moing, how do you do it? He goes to all this great lengths to tell us how we do it. But notice what he says in the second line. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 9 words in the middle. After you do the mila, after you do the priya, then you do the metzitza. How do you do it? right? We have to pull the blood. We have to suck the blood out from the distant and far places. And by doing that, sorry, I'll mute everybody. I hear you. Okay, hold on. I'm putting the source sheets back here in the chat. Sorry, I'm just teaching and managing the chat. So, sorry, everybody who's here in person. Okay, back over here. So, what the Gemara in Shabbos, what the Rambam is telling us here is that the purpose of sucking the blood is by removing the blood from these distant and far places, and we pull it out, and that is what helps keep the baby safe. And so we see from here that Mila and Priya, I think, are the two essential ritual acts, but Metzizah and bandaging are essential, but they are what we would call therapeutic acts. These are actions that are done to protect the baby, but they're not integral to the mitzvah itself. Everyone with me so far? Okay. So not everybody actually reads the Gemara this way. Not everybody sees it quite as simply that Metzizah is not part and parcel of the actual mitzvah of Milah. For instance, the Avnei Nezer here in box number 6, he says we can actually read something very differently. We can deduce a totally different interpretation of the Gemara. And he says that if the only issue for Metzizah was sakana, if the only thing that we were really worried about was danger for the baby, right? So take a look here. If the entire purpose of doing Metzizah was to protect the baby from danger, that was the only reason why we did it, and you had to do a Brit Milah on Shabbat, what's the way that you can get around this? Normally you can't do this on Shabbat, so simply do the Brit Milah right at the end of Shabbat, so it's still Shabbos, and then as soon as Shabbos is over, do your Metzizah. It was about sakana. Why would we put the baby in extra risk? And why would we purposely violate Shabbat by doing something during the middle of the day? Let's simply push it back. The Avnei Nezer says, if this is what it was really about, if it's really just about sakana, so let's push it back. And by pushing it back, then we won't have any problems. So the Avnei Nezer says that we have to conclude from this that there's actually a mitzvah element which necessitates it to also be done on the 8th day of the Brit Milah itself. And he says that since the omission of Metzizah as a sakana, it then becomes part of the Milah. In other words, it actually is a third component of the Brit Milah, Avnei Nezer says. It's simply just the fact that that protects the baby that is part of the mitzvah of Milah as well. It's not just that we remove the foreskin. It's not just that we do the priya, but we actually have to protect the baby as well, and therefore it's part of the mitzvah itself. And so this is what the Avnei Nezer says, and he reads it differently, which seems to suggest that maybe the mitzvah of Metzizah is part of the Brit Milah. And if it's part of the Brit Milah, fast forward to the 1830s or till today, that means that that suction is really important. It has to happen. If we can argue that, if we can prove, for instance, that suction is not part of the actual baby, not part of the Brit Milah, and it's simply there to protect the baby. So then if we can then prove that it doesn't protect the baby, if we can prove that the suction itself actually is more dangerous for the baby, then we can remove Metzizah altogether. We never have to do Metzizah. And what's interesting is that for literally, not just like 1 year or 2 years, hundreds of years, centuries of years, this is what was done. It was done Metzizah BaPeh. The way that the suction happened was literally with one's mouth. Now you might say, I don't understand. Like, what do you mean it's done by one's mouth? It's exactly what you think it is. The baby has a Brit Milah. The baby begins to bleed in their groin area, and the mohel will use their mouth to suck out the blood. And as the Rambam says, it has to come from the deep places. So a person needs to be able to really suck out the blood. And that was what was done. In fact, I saw this Taz last night. I couldn't believe it. I've never seen this before. Take a look in box number 8 on top of the page. Yeah.
Well, I have a question on the Avnei Nezer. So what does it do with the Isplanit and Kamon?
It's the same thing. It's considered like a salve. Yeah, it's the same
So
idea.
it's part of the mitzvah, because then we can ask the same. Why not do it?
Yeah, bandaging.
Out?
Yeah, so
And nobody says that's part of the mitzvah, no? that the Esplanade.
Yeah, so I think that Ispanin and Kimon go together with the Metzizah. It's all part of, it's a package deal
It's a
of
package.
what we do to protect the baby. We're protecting the baby from sakana by doing these things. Now look at the Taz for a second, box number 8. It's crazy. It's a nutty thing. I mean, I don't mean to say such a thing, but I literally stumbled across this at like 1 o'clock in the morning. I was like, I couldn't believe this. Maybe I was 1 o'clock in the morning. So when I read it now, it might not be as interesting. Let's see. So Mahalin bein Kriyat Torah. So in the Shulchan Aruch here is talking here about a Brit Milah on Rosh Hashanah. When do you do the Brit Milah? At what point? It's a pretty long davening. When do we do it? So he says Mahalin bein Kriyat Torah. We do it around the Kriyat Torah, the reading of the Torah. So Shamati Shagaon Harav Meharav Fivish Mikrakav. So Rav Fivish of Krakow, Zatzal Haya Mal b'Rosh Hashanah. He did a Brit Milah on Rosh Hashanah. Velo kanach piv achar hamila. He didn't clean the blood out of his mouth after he did the Brit Milah. Why? Ela BaPeh meluchach b'dam mila taka b'shofar le'arev mitzvah mila b'shofar. Rather, he blew the shofar with the blood in his mouth so the mitzvah of mila and shofar could be joined. Everyone catch that? So in case you were curious as to how the mitzvah of mila was done, in case you were curious in this time period, how they actually did Metzizah and whether it was done, here is proof that on Rosh Hashanah 1 year, Rabbi Feifel of Krakow, who also was the local Moel and also is the Baal Tzekiah, he did a Brit Milah right before a shofar blowing, and he didn't wipe off the blood from his mouth. He simply kept it there so that he would be able to blow the shofar and be able to take these two mitzvos of shofar and Milah and mix them together. And again, there's actually some interesting ideas of why the mitzvah of Milah actually is interesting to tie into the mitzvah of shofar, thinking about Abraham and Yitzchak and the covenant. There's a lot to unpack about that, but maybe for another year, and this may be too graphic for us this evening at 8:30 in the evening. So this is, so again, just to summarize here, if we can prove, or if we believe that Metzizah, again, suction, nowhere does the Rambam talk, by the way, about oral suction with one's mouth, but I just showed you, there is no other way to suck. How else do you remove the blood? At this time, the only way a person thought to suck the blood was with one's mouth. And so this is how it was done. People suck the blood with their mouth. So if we believe that the purpose of Metzizah is to remove sakana, that it is to remove danger from the baby, if we believe that, then that would lend itself to suggest that if we can prove that Metzizah itself is dangerous to a baby, then perhaps it's not necessary. On the other hand, if we say that Metzizah is part and parcel of the Brit Milah experience, and the fact that, yes, it was believed to remove sakana, and that's what makes it part of the mitzvah of Milah, so even if it does cause danger, perhaps it would be permissible. Now, there's no scientific facts. We have no data. We actually have very poor data even up until today in many respects. But certainly there's very little data of anything between the Taz's comment over here from Revival of Krakow all the way to the 1830s, where we started our share. There's very little data whatsoever to know, well, how many babies did this affect and how many babies died like this? It was impossible to know. They had different type of healthcare systems, different type of doctors, medicine was different. It was different in 1830 than it was in 1930 than it is almost now in 2022. And so if you look here in box number 9, there's a great history here that kind of gives us more depth to what's going on here. So in 1831, this is in Vienna, a number of infants were circumcised in the city and became quite ill. And so you can imagine local doctors determined that it was the same mohel made everyone sick. So in 1831, Professor Wolfers, a German professor, published a Mohel's guidebook. And in it, he attempted to demonstrate that the sole purpose of the Metzizah procedure is to serve as a therapeutic measure for the medical safety of the infant, and that it's not an integral part of the mitzvah of Brit Milah. And consequently, he asserted that since, to his knowledge, modern science does not recognize any health advantages in such a procedure, on the contrary, it invites the transmission of diseases between the mohel and the infant, it should not be performed. And so in his book, Dr. Rolfos alludes to a venereal infection which plagued that generation. He speculates a number of children contracted the bacteria from the mohel at their britot, at their circumcisions. In the 1830s, In Vienna, a number of infants who were circumcised in the city became sick and many died. The local doctors determined the same mohel was responsible for the sickness due to Metzizah BaPeh. And although the mohel in question was examined, he showed no signs of sickness. There were a number of local infants who experienced a skin eruption on the Mila area after their britot, after their circumcisions were performed by this particular mohel. The lesions were first localized at the Mila location, but then spread to the rest of the body, and they resulted in a number of fatalities. The mohel was examined and no sign of disease was noticed on him. Still and all, the doctors speculated that it came from this mohel. And so the Yad Eliezer asks the Chasam Sofer, Rabbi Eliezer Horowitz, the Rav of Vienna, and he was approached here in 1835 by Dr. Wertheim, who was the head of the Jewish Vienna Hospital, concerned about this issue. And he asked him to make a psak. He said, we have babies who are dying. What do we need to do to keep them healthy and safe? We need to stop this Metzizah BaPeh. We need to stop this oral suction because literally babies are dying. And so the Yad Eliezer, Rabbi Eliezer Horowitz, he said, that's a pretty, we've been doing it in a certain way for generations. I don't feel comfortable doing this until I write a letter to the Chasam Sofer, my rabbi, and to see what he says. And so if you turn over the page in box number 10, this is a translation. I actually found the original letter, which is also in German. I think I saw Nathan Kahn here, so maybe he can translate it for anybody, or Ari, if anyone else wants to look at it, I can get you a copy of the original in the German. It's really cool, actually. It's in Hebrew and German. But this is the translation that I found as well on the interwebs, which is pretty good. So he writes back to him. This is the Chasam Sofer's tshuva. Your valuable letter has reached me. You write correctly that we find no requirement to do Metzizah specifically with the mouth. Only the Mekubalim require this, for they say that divine judgment is softened through mouths and lips. We do not reckon, however, with the hidden when there's even a minute danger. The root meats or motzates are the same as in Proverbs. So patience under pressure produces strife, and in Judges regarding Gidon and wrung out the dew from the fleece, Rashi explains these as squeezing out to remove forcefully, etc., etc. Let's scroll down here to last 7 lines. This applies to Metzizah as well. Now, as to the bondage and kuman, we do not use kuman at all, nor the particular bandage mentioned by the Gemara, by Abai and Rava. Thus, we see that since it is only for therapeutic purposes, we need not be concerned if doctors devise other methods in their stead. The same applies to Metzizah. So in other words, the Chasam Sofer says, in the same way that we don't use those old-fashioned bandages, we have new ways of protecting the babies. So therefore, if we can find a new way to do the suction that is less dangerous, so we should do such a thing. Even if the Mishnah had mentioned the Metzizah is performed with the mouth, we would still be able to substitute something similar. However, they should exhort the expert doctors to testify truthfully whether the sponge has the same effect as Metzizah with the mouth. More than this, according to my humble opinion, we need not be concerned. May Hashem heal you and strengthen you in accordance with the wishes of your precious soul and the wishes of your devoted friend who desires your constant well-being. In other words, the Chasam Sofer comes and offers an enormous chiddush here in the mid 1800s. He says, Metzizah, it's important. The Gemara talks about it, the Mishnah talks about it. Sucking the blood, the Rambam mentions that we got to take it from the deep places. You want to suck the blood? You know how you can suck the blood? Use a sponge. The sponge will suck out some blood. And if you use this sponge, this will save these. This will actually save the. This will save the children, God forbid, who are ill, who are receiving this viral infection, a bacterial infection they didn't know about. And so this is the Chasam Sofer. He says we can't rely on this idea that there is no danger. We have to assume that there is a danger, and therefore we need to act accordingly. Now, this, as you can imagine, did not sit well with a lot of people. It didn't sit well with this was at the height. If you can imagine what's going on in the world, the Reform movement is like really ramping up in a major way. The Orthodox movement is hunkering down, doing everything they can to stop the Reform movement from encroaching. I actually think that this is the time, if I remember correctly from my modern Jewish history course in college, this is the time that sermons became popular by Orthodox rabbis. Until this time, Orthodox rabbis did not give sermons. It was only when the Reformers started giving sermons because they wanted to be like their non-Jewish friends that they said, okay, we need to do something. They brought in organs. We have to do something. to engage the people. And so they came and gave sermons. The irony is that now people would like to get rid of the sermons, right? So you can thank the 1800s for that.
Not only sermons, the Kiddush was also was done now in the vernacular.
Correct, in the vernacular. That's what I meant by sermons. Yes, like they were spoken in the vernacular. Correct. So you can thank anytime you find a drasha is going too long, you can thank the 1830s for that. But so on the one hand, you had people who are challenging the very traditional aspects of Torah and mitzvot. And so when people are challenging you in that way, what do? What's the natural response? It's to hunker down and say, we're not changing anything from our tradition. Chas v'shalom, our tradition is whole. You can't, once you open up a little bit and say, well, things are a little bit different now. In fact, if you go back to the previous page, the Tiferet Yisrael was written around the same time. This is box number 11. He actually describes something remarkable. His language, he says, let's look here, 1, 2, 3. I'll just read from the beginning. That which all the doctors are saying now, they're saying nowadays that you can become, it's dangerous to do Metzizah. Others will die by doing Metzizah. You might think for a second, he says, this is different than the Gemara. The Gemara says about Metzizah, and then it's all this. He goes to, and how does he describe it? He says there are some things that are just different. The world is different. In the time of the rabbis, in the time of the Mishnah, Gemara, that's how the world was, and the time is simply different now, and that's just it. Now, what's interesting is if you keep reading this on your own, you'll notice that he actually does not feel comfortable with the Chasam Sofer's innovation of using a sponge. He says times are different. We need to really think about this issue, and it's clear that it's a problem, but it's hard to know exactly how big this problem is, and so we should probably keep it the way it is, but we should keep looking into it. In other words, the Tiferet Yisrael opens up for us what I think is a fascinating box that medicine or science can change. And if science changes different from that which the rabbis experienced when the rabbis thought they knew something, which, by the way, they knew a lot of things, so then maybe we could look at things differently, interpret them, change them accordingly. In the end, he does not hold like the Chasam Sofer. And the biggest proponent against the Chasam Sofer is the Maram Shik in box number 12, which you can read on your own. He really disagrees forcefully. He says once Chazal established a danger, the only way to disprove the danger is through observations, experiments, statistics. But all this is telling us the fact that a few babies died, quote unquote, a few babies, Rahman al-Islam, even if one baby is too many babies, but that's not statistically significant. In other words, if this is such a big issue, you would expect to have many, many, many more babies dying. So it might be true, it's not sure. So he says we can't challenge these things. And he goes as far to suggest that he thinks Metzizah might even be halacha Moshe Sinai. That it might actually be, that's what he says, halacha Moshe Sinai. And he takes it even further and he says, again, we're under attack and we have to really hunker down and we can't allow that to happen, especially when the reformers are coming. So again, in the 1840s, there was a Torah periodical called Shomer Tzion HaNe'eman. It was founded and edited by Rabbi Yaakov Ettlinger. And the argument about Metzizah BaPeh, as you can imagine, there was no internet, but this was like, the hot ticket, what everyone was talking about at the Shabbos table. Again, the Maram Shik is like 1878 when he writes this.
So what is his opinion? What is his position? Ettlinger?
Ettlinger, so it's interesting that some actually accused that this tshuva of the Chasam Sofer was a fake. So this is how you know it got exciting in the 1800s. Yeah, so people felt like it was so out there for him to suggest such a thing that it could be that Rabbi Elazar Horowitz, perhaps he faked the letter. And there are some who to this day believe that there's no way the Chasam Sofer would have ever said anything like that.
So Ettlinger was not with us?
So no, so one second before we get to Ettlinger. So just to give you like a quick, I want to bring us up to the early, more modern times. So in 1873, before we get to Ettlinger, so in 1873, the New York City Board of Health also was called in to deal with some cases. In 1887, a rabbi in the German city of Fulda, Rabbi Michael Kahn, invented a small tube, a glass tube, to be able to do oral suction, but via tube. Why is that better? Well, if a person is not putting their mouth on the other person, on the baby, so then would hopefully prevent any bacteria, any virus from a person's mouth to go onto the baby. And so using the tubes. And that tube were reluctantly agreed upon by Rav Israel Hildesheimer, Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, Rav Yitzchak Elchanan Spechter, Rav Chaim Berlin, and many others as well felt strongly. Rav Chaim Soloveitchik, Rav Moshe Soloveitchik, his grandson, the Rav, all of them, and more modern times, Rav Kook, Rav Herzog, Rav Tzvi Pesach Frank, Rav Shlomo Zalman, and some even say Rav Moshe felt that using Metzizah BaPeh, but BaPeh using the tube, this glass tube, that could fulfill, that makes everybody happy. This is an innovation where technology helps save the day. Someone came up with this idea, and so we can still do oral suction without having to put our mouth on the wound. And this way, everyone could kind of be happy. Now, not everybody felt that way. Some felt that it still need to be with a person's mouth, and that include the Stipler, Rav Elyashiv, and others. Now, let's fast forward just for a moment here to 2004. So in 2004, you can read the details here in box number 13. This is a great article, a pretty intellectually honest article in the pages of the Jewish Observer, which is like the Aguda's magazine. I actually have a copy of the whole paper if anyone wants to see it from that year. Actually does a good job of telling the story. On October 26th, an 18-year-old baby boy died in my mom's medical center in Brooklyn. The cause of death was a viral infection known as herpes simplex virus type 1, HSV1. And the infant's twin brother was also diagnosed with HSV1. And Baruch Hashem, he survived, but the New York State Department of Health and Mental Hygiene becomes aware of this, and they get all involved. And that's a big to do. And you can read like all the details here about what happened and the different cases that were happening and how the health department tried to involve themselves. Now, in 2004, at the same time, a study was put together and published in Pediatrics. So Pediatrics is the Journal of the American Academy of Pediatrics. That's what it's known as. It's like a pretty big deal. And it was written by none other than Rabbi Moshe Tendler. So Rabbi Tendler decides to involve himself in this, not involve himself, Rabbi Tendler uses his medical knowledge and his rabbinic knowledge, and he helps co-author this piece, which was also written by Bria Ben Zev and Benjamin Gesundheit and some others. And you can look on the next page in box 14 to see what their conclusion is about Metzizah and whether or not it should be done with one's mouth. Our findings provide evidence that ritual Jewish circumcision with oral Metzizah may cause oral genital transmission of HSV infection, resulting in clinical disease, including involvement of the skin, mucous membranes, and HSV. I'm not a doctor. Furthermore, oral suction may not only endanger the child, but may also expose them all to human immunodeficiency, virus, HIV, or hepatitis B from infected infants. The same consideration that led the Talmudic sages once to establish the custom of the Metzizah for the sake of the infant can now be applied to persuade them all to use instrumental suction, to not do Metzizah BaPeh. Now, this was a nice study that was done, but unsurprisingly, like oftentimes, I mean, I think this is something that probably resonates deeply with us in this time period we're living in, where medical facts, when we talk about like the coronavirus, are debated and almost, I want to say politicized. So that's almost what's happened as well here. So Daniel S. Berman, a doctor, an infectious disease specialist, argued that the pediatric study was fraught with inaccuracies and unsubstantiated conclusions. And if you read here in box 15, Chaim David Zweibel continues his attack on this. And just look what he says here. It's really like, it's out there. So the Metzizah BaPeh issue has been with us for a long time. Authors wishing to argue for one side or other can easily find earlier support supporting their particular view. Yet, the selective quoting that has been practiced is unfortunate. Worse, it's misleading and downright dishonest. Any study of Metzizah BaPeh that fails to acknowledge the Chasam Sofer's lenient ruling on the issue is dishonest. By the same token, any quote of the Chasam Sofer's ruling that fails to acknowledge the written testimony of Maharam Shik, his most famous disciple, as we talked about, that the ruling was issued under unusual circumstances is also dishonest. I'm not accustomed to studying medical literature. On any given day, I read far more Hebrew than English. The texts that I study are often in disagreement, presenting different opinions. They are, however, unfailingly honest. They routinely cite sources that support an opposing view. I do not know, perhaps selective quoting is accepted in academia. Still, I would hope that we are more honest than that. How disappointing that today's debate has fallen terribly below these ideals. And so this recent pediatric paper on Metzizah presents the Chasam Sofer's ruling as normative and accepted by all. I was trained in rabbinics, not in medicine, and I cannot comment on the medical findings in the study. If, however, the medical portion of the report is as intellectually honest as a halachic statement, it should be viewed with great suspicion. So you can imagine, right? You can get the sense of the tension here in 2006, and this goes back and forth, and Rabbi Tendler is challenged accordingly. Now, in case you're curious, the RCA's position on this is that, Rav Schachter, Rav Willig, and others felt strongly that Metzizah BaPeh with one's mouth should not be done, but rather a person should use oral suction with a tube, and that really solves for our problems, and a person should do it this way, even though there's different opinions. However, there is another element of this debate, which, right or wrong, is part of the debate. In the same way that in the 1830s, there was a concern for reformers and the importance of protecting Judaism from the outside, there's the same concern that many parts of the community had about protecting the community from the outside government. Well, if all of a sudden we start allowing the government and the health department to regulate how we do Brit Milah and how we do circumcision, that's going to be a problem. They're overreaching into our way of life. How do we know they're not going to come and say that a Brit Milah is inhumane or barbaric? In fact, there was a bill not so long ago in California that said, how dare you do a Brit Milah to a child? The child should have a choice whether or not they want to be circumcised. And while we might find that to be silly, maybe we do or we don't, that is a concern. And so the RCA put out a statement actually in 2012 that actually supports the recent call of the Gouda to New York City Mayor Michael Bloomberg and the New York Health Department, instead of unilaterally imposing regulations, to collaborate with Orthodox Jewish leadership to develop protocols to address health concerns. In fact, there used to be, Rav Tendler writes in one of his responsa about this, that there used to be something called the Mila board, that there was in order to be a certified mohel, you had to be passed on by the Mila board, the circumcision board, that would ensure that all the quality, that everything happened exactly the way it needed to be, and the stern standards were kept. But over time, after the president of the Mila board passed away or he retired, as these things happen, it kind of fell away. And so the thought was that we need to have better standards in Brit Milah to ensure that we're keeping everybody safe in every which way. So that was the RCA statement in 2012. Let's go back to our friend, Rabbi Tendler. So Rabbi Tendler did not give up on his push. And one of the things that I think we've seen about Rabbi Tendler was his veracity, his strength of opinion, and the fact that he would not allow anybody to bully him. So you can look here in box 17, it's a lengthy article. We're not going to read all of it, obviously, but it's a fascinating article in the foreword in March of 2005 that describes what Rabbi Tendler's life was like after he came out against the right. Now, let's just put this in perspective based on the learning we've been doing. We talked about how in the 1950s, Rabbi Tendler did everything he could to protect Judaism from what was at that time the left. Now we see Rabbi Tendler is doing whatever he thinks he can to protect Judaism from those on the right. It's really a fascinating perspective. It's indicative of who he was. Look how they describe it in the underlined portion. In recent weeks, ultra-Orthodox newspapers have condemned Tendler and accused him of reporting Fisher to health officials. Fisher is the mohel in question, a claim that Tendler vehemently denies. They're accusing him of ratting out the mohel and being like a spy from the local government. The baby's death is reportedly being investigated by New York City Health Department. According to Tendler, prank callers have inundated his home phone and vandals have struck at the synagogue in Muncie where he serves as religious leader. And he goes on, right? He's like, I'm not going to live in fear, right? And this is around the same time as the Siyum HaShas is happening in Madison Square Garden. And so that's run by the Aguda, the big Siyum HaShas. And Rabbi Tendler chooses not to go, which is really unbelievable. Rabbi Tendler, Torah giant, Rosh Yeshiva, Yeshiva University, does not go to the big Siyum HaShas celebration. And he said it's not out of fear, but it's really out of respect from the Gouda, because he didn't want to take away from the Simcha of Torah. But this elevated to such a place that Rabbi Tendler himself was literally being threatened in every single which way. If you flip over, you can see here more that Yated Na'aman published a 3-page editorial condemning Tendler, claiming that he had reported Fisher to the health authorities. The editorial accused Tendler of Metzizah, of handing over a Jew to an anti-Semitic state government that could do harm to the Jew in question. The newspaper subsequently ran a letter from Rabbi Tendler in which he strongly denied the claims, right? Tendler tells the Ford that he's getting these prank phone calls, once every 3 minutes they're happening. They're giggling, they're laughing, they're calling him an anti-Semite, right? They're saying terrible things. That he notifies the police about vandalism, harassment, right? And again, it's just, his life is really, he's under tremendous attack. Now, so on the one hand, when you read that part of the story, it's actually, in my opinion, it tells an amazing part of Rabbi Tendler's courage. He's not going to allow people to bully him when he thinks there's something important saving, in his mind, Jewish baby lives. At the same time, Rabbi Tendler had a tendency sometimes to not exactly help himself in these types of circumstances. So while he was fighting vociferously against those who wished to go in the traditional method of Metzizah, BaPeh, oral suction with one's mouth and not the tube, so he said some choice words about that. He says, for example, in an article in Metzizah, he's quoted as saying, Tendler is not, this is the last line here, Tendler is now continuing his war against Metzizah BaPeh, calling it, quote, it's a hoax perpetuated by some of the rabbis. So that's pretty inflammatory language that Rabbi Tendler is using, obviously because he was under attack himself, and because obviously he is passionate about this. But what we learn from Rabbi Tendler here, and he literally to the day of his death fought tooth and nail for this, because he believed that he was really saving Jewish babies. And he also believed the halacha, like we talked about from the very beginning, that this was an issue of sakana, and that nowadays there is no issue of sakana if you believe that, and if you believe Metzizah is not part and parcel of the actual mitzvah of Mila itself. He actually quotes Rav Soloveitchik. Rav Soloveitchik felt that there was no need to do Metzizah at all. But even if you want to hold, like others, like Rabbi Nezer and others, that Metzizah is part of the mitzvah of Mila, so fine. So do oral suction, but use oral suction simply using a glass tube, and don't actually do it with your mouth. So he fought really to the day, to his last day, and was often once he was referred to as a lonely voice of sanity in that insane asylum called Monsey. I'm not suggesting that, God forbid, I have family who lives there, but the point is that he lived in it. This isn't a man who was shooting from the ivory tower and shouting from the ivory tower, whether it was in Riverdale or in Teaneck or in a place where he was surrounded by like-minded people. He was living in Monsey. He's right in the thick of it, and he's fighting tooth and nail for what he believes in. And so what we see from this, I think, is just how courageous he could be, just how passionate he could be, just how unbullied he could be, that he would not allow anyone to push him around. And that when he saw a need for both a medical opinion and a halachic opinion together, he made it his business to involve himself in that situation. If you actually do the research, he was not that involved in the actual study that was published in pediatrics, as much as he was there really as a consultant. But he lended his name and put his name on that study when it was published in the American Academy of Pediatrics Journal, because he understood the weight that it carried and the respect that he had. And so there's no doubt that Rabbi Tendler is certainly a complicated person. He was a person with strong beliefs, a person who was maybe not liked by all, but one thing is certain, is he was a man who lived his life with tremendous amount of, I think, integrity, and who lived his life really believing the things that he believed in and sticking to those beliefs, and fighting to the end to make sure that people could be safe, whether it was people on the left or the right. For Rabbi Tendler, it was never, I'm going to say it differently. For Rabbi Tendler, these were often not issues that were related to movements as necessarily as much. I think it might have just been what he was doing is fighting for what he thought was truth. I think there is something to be said for that when we really believe something, there's something really inspiring to not allow someone to talk us out of an opinion, or to have an opinion that maybe is not so popular. Just because you have that opinion doesn't mean that you shouldn't share it. Maybe you should share it with less inflammatory language, but it's still, I think, a lesson for us to learn. And we just pray that Rabbi Tendler's neshama should have an aliyah, and that his memory should be a blessing for us all, and that his work in the fields of medical ethics, his works in Torah, his work being close to Rabbi Feinstein and others, that it should continue to be a blessing. His memory should be a blessing for all of us and our entire community. Okay, we'll stop here. I'm happy to take questions before we wrap up, if anyone has any, that is.
So you didn't get back. I'm very interested in knowing what Yaakov Tendler said, because he was the Rav of Hirsch. Hirsch